No, it is not. Carry on.
Good, 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 good. So we'll do this, Graylan, till about maximum 3:15. I'll start drawing things to a close, maybe along about 5 or 10 after 3. And again, I'll just say something like, we want to give Pastor Hagler the last word, but I want to close with an announcement or two, and then I'll turn it back over to you for some parting words. And like I say, you can do whatever you want to at that point. Some people have prayed, and others have given us a charge, for us and wherever communities that we've been. Others have given us a blessing, or they've summarized what they've said. So it's just really up to you, however you want to close the interview.
Sure.
One last thing, Graylan, how have you been doing with the pandemic? I mean, we're not even talking about that much anymore in our public discourse. Had you been socially distancing and all of that? Or
Well, I've
I know you
gotten
haven't
hit with a heavy spam funeral as soon as the pandemic hit.
Say that again, please.
I've been hit with about 20 funerals since the pandemic hit of my members.
And so, how you been doing that, in person or
some of it people have not done funerals, but some of it people have done funerals, and I've even live streamed some of the funerals from the church.
Wow. I may ask you to say a word about ministry in a time of pandemic, if you don't mind.
I think this is the first week. This is the first week, and I'm not through it yet, but it's the first week without a funeral. But I do have a death because my choir director passed 2 days ago.
I may ask you about that if you don't mind.
Sure.
Mike, we have a bunch of people waiting, and it's 2 o'clock. I'll let them in.
Yep, I know. Good. So you have let them in, Terry?
I will. I just.
Here they come. Here they come. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, based in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We're the Indiana voice for peace, justice, human rights, and intercultural encounter. To prevent Zoom bombing, we're keeping screens muted. If you'd like to send a question to our guest, please do that via the chat function at the bottom of the screen. I'll be monitoring it for your questions. We want to say thank you to Ben Clemmer from WBOI for recording this interview to make it available to a wider audience at a later date. For over 5 decades, Graylan Hagler has been on the front lines in Chicago, Boston, and Washington, D.C., and continues his advocacy for political, economic, and racial justice. He has protested injustices against Blacks and Latinos, confronted corporations on hiring practices, and challenged local governments' systemic injustices, including as an outspoken critic of military tactics used by police. He has marched, organized coalitions, been arrested, all the while continuing as a voice of nonviolent resistance. He's been a tireless partner in the struggle for full Palestinian political and human rights, too. Graylan is senior pastor at Plymouth Congregational Church, United Church of Christ, in Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. co-leader of the Poor People's Campaign. So it's timely and important that we speak today with our friend, Pastor Graylan Hagler. Hagler, welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
Let's get right to it, Graylan. For those of us around the country, while we remain drawn to Minneapolis and all that's happening there, in fact, the memorial service for George Floyd is happening as we speak. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we've also been following what's been happening in our nation's capital. So why don't you update us about about the latest in Washington, D.C.?
Well, there's been actions pretty much every day. We've under 11 p.m. curfew last night, but the previous 2 nights we were on a 7 p.m. curfew as they tried to quote unquote clamp down on the protesters and the demonstration. You know, one of the important things is that as you know, because everybody saw it on Monday, basically protesters were attacked by military police, by police, and they were pepper bombed and rubber bullets and pushed out of the way with shields so that the guy in the White House could walk across Lafayette Park and stand in front of the Episcopal Church there on the corner across from the park and hold up his Bible and had nothing to say, but held up his Bible as a symbolic tactic to continue to try to fan the flames of his base. And so there's been demonstrations. And the one thing that I thought was great, the next day, which would have been Tuesday, the crowd really quadrupled outside of Lafayette Park in response to the tactic that happened the previous day. And so they were stretched all the way back down 16th Street and all around. And one of the things that the president has been engaged in is trying to enlarge the perimeter of protection, which only demonstrates that they're really afraid of the public, really afraid of these voices. I don't know if they expected for the reaction to be as strong as it has been, but one of the things that is clear is that they cannot put this genie back in the bottle because people are really sick and tired. And also, I think the thing that really got to folks was to be able to graphically look at video as somebody dies in front of your eyes all over the country and all over the world. Because I've received notices that people have been marching in Amsterdam, and people have been marching in the UK, and people have been marching all over. Palestinians have stood up in solidarity with what is going on in this country, because people recognize what it looks like when folks attempt to oppress, when folks do oppress, the kind of characteristics that they carry on. It's a fascism. And I think clearly in the United States, we can realize just how fragile this thing we have called a democracy is.
Yeah, I've also seen the picture, and it's still continuing, I believe. And think of the symbol of this, troops lining the steps of the Lincoln Memorial as they overlook protesters in D.C. I mean, I'm not ignorant of Lincoln's mixed legacy, you know, during the Civil War. But isn't it mind-boggling to find troops guarding the Lincoln Memorial from people participating in nonviolent demonstrations, protesting the killing of an unarmed Black man? I mean, it's mind-boggling, really.
Well, they understand that symbolically, that's where the 1963 march took place, where King spoke. So they understand the symbolism of that, understand the symbolism of what it means if everyday people take over that monument and is able to organize and speak from that monument. So they're trying to close down all those symbols from the people.
You've been involved in protests and demonstrations your entire adult life. And you build broad coalitions between people of different faiths and also just people of goodwill of no particular religious faith. And yet you are a Christian pastor. I want you to say a word about the optics and just the use and abuse of the president's use of the Bible as a prop in the church, St. John's Church, as a prop on Monday night. You referred to it, but say a little bit more about that.
Well, I'm gonna come at it this way. That very seldom do we talk about that there is no one Christian movement. There are Christian movements that have been filled with hatred and the justification of enslavement, the justification of settler colonialism, the justification of the extermination of Native people on this soil and in South America and all over the Caribbean, the depopulation of Africa sanctioned by a certain kind of Christianity that is really empire Christianity. It does nothing but love power. It is very macho and very masculine in its nature, and it is very fundamentalist, and it enforces a status quo kind of value system. On the other hand, there's a faith movement that has always been a resistance to the status quo. It's always been a faithful resistance to empire religion. And so when he walked out there and held up his Bible in front of the church, it was a statement to that empire religion, that we're still together. We're going to fight to hold on to this thing. We're going to fight to return me to office, because we know that's what he's talking about. But he held up that Bible in which to solidify that very racist base, that Klan originating base. Somebody might get upset with that, but that's really the nature of religion. We've always had a religion that preached, slaves be obedient to your masters. We always had a religion that preached that secular authority has been appointed by God. And I hear people all the time, particularly that Mr. Pillow guy, saying that this man in the White House has been elected and ordained by God. And I'm putting that out there because you got one of them pillars, burn it. Got one of those pillars, throw them out of your house, right? Don't buy one. And that's a part of the sort of the struggle that we're engaged in when they talk about cultural wars. It's not culture, it's ideology. It's an ideological war. It's a war of theology. It's a war in order for those of us who believe in inclusion and those of us who believe in hearing one another and respecting one another versus those who want to control the world and bend the world towards their own ideology and their own understanding and their own greed, because it's not just bending it to their ideology. It's also bending the world into a kind of paradigm where they can steal everything they want, including lands and culture and resources. So that's the battle. So he stood up there and basically tapped into his ideological base, which we have to struggle against and deal with.
Brother Cornel West talked about, calls the president a neo-fascist gangster. So you were gentle compared to Brother Cornel. Hey, let's return now to the reason why the people are out in the streets, and I want you to say a word about George Floyd. Already in the 1980s, you were an outspoken critic of, and earlier than that, Chicago's and Boston's police departments' gang control tactics involving the searching of young black men on the streets without a warrant or probable cause. You became vice president of the Massachusetts Civil Liberties Union. Now we add the names of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd to an ever-growing list. I mean, it's an ever-growing list, right, of African-American men and women who've been killed sleeping while black, jogging while black, shopping while black. Talk to us about the systemic racism and rage that really this latest murder really of George Floyd, where it's caught on video camera, that's sweeping the country.
And that's the issue. These are the names we know. There are thousands of names that we don't know.
Yeah.
Where folks have gotten away with the victimization and the murder of people. When I arrived in Boston in 1981, I was there a few months before I ended up being locked up and charged with about 15 charges, one including attempted murder, and of a police officer, I might add. And I was on trial for the next year and a half. And one of the things that got me was that after I originally got out of jail, got bailed out, I'm home and I turn on TV and I watching the news, and the district attorney goes on the air live and says that we have a very dangerous person, an outside agitator who's pretending to be clergy, and we're gonna get 45 years in max security prison on him. He was referring to me. And so that when the fight was on and I realized that they were serious. And what was going on was that we were doing a lot of racial justice organizing then in the midst of illegal police searches, in the midst of whites really just patrolling the streets of Boston and jumping on Black families and beating Black couples and beating Black individuals, and nobody ever going to jail, nobody ever being locked up for that. And so we started opposing it, we started organizing around it, and that was their message back to me was, we're gonna show you how we can handle you. Well, you know, God is always a great God because they didn't handle me too well. And I ended up walking out of that courtroom, like I said, a year and a half later, totally exonerated. But, you know, it's those types of things because I could have easily been in max security prison. Guy, when I was doing prison ministry in Walpole, which is max security prison, just called me like a month ago. And he called me to tell me this. He says, Rev, he says, there's not a day that has gone by that I've not thought about you, and you're the first call I'm making. I'm out. He had been in for 45 years.
Oh my.
45 years for something that he did not do. And when he finally was able, 45 years later, to get a new trial, the evidence that was there wasn't there. And it also came out that they had trumped up testimony against him to put him away. And so I'm raising all this because that's how it takes place. So, you know, in the NAACP years ago, 30s, 20s, 30s, 40s, used to hang a flag out of their headquarters that say, yesterday a man was lynched, in response to the lynchings that were taking place all around the country, to remind people that people were actually being lynched, not in the paper anywhere, not recorded anywhere. Folks didn't have telephone cameras, all those types of things. I mean, so things took place in such a way to try to, in a sense, intimidate and keep Black folks in their place. I was just looking through a newspaper article, and an old newspaper article post, and it was so interesting, the attitude, and it shows you the attitude. Oscar DePriest gets elected on the south side of Chicago to Congress. And he gets elected because of really the migration from the South into places like Chicago that created a very large Black community. And so he's the first one, pretty much, first one since Reconstruction to be returned to Congress. And the president's wife or something invited the wives of Congress people to the White House for luncheon. And of course, Oscar DePriest's wife was in that crowd, which I don't think the president, first lady realized it, but invited her, and she went. And there was a senator from South Carolina that was quoted in the Washington Post, said, now we got to lynch 1,000 of them to put them back in their place. That's the mentality. And so what I'm getting at is that it's only being caught on camera now. It's only coming to light right now. But this is the stuff that Black folks have been dealing with historically. You know, it's, as somebody said, you know, we're not only got to hold our breath from the pandemic, we got to hold our breath around cops. We got to hold our breath around all kinds of institutionalized racism. We got to hold our breath around white supremacy, and we got to hold our breath now more than ever. And so finally, we particularly got young folks who are breathing, who are showing us all how to breathe, showing us all how to walk across this country, move across this country, wake up this country, and try to deliver something of worth to this country. Because we've been playing games around racism and white supremacy for years.
I want to ask you about the pandemic in a minute, but I want to return to what you said just a few minutes ago. You know, just as you said that there are many Christianities present within Christian history, some that have been life affirming, many that have been life negating. Likewise, there have been different Americas. And the America that we're seeing now with Black Hawk helicopters deployed in the nation's capital and armed military supplementing local police. This vision of America, these competing visions of America have dominated our discourse in the last number of years, but particularly under this president.
Well, this president is upfront with it. That's the only difference, because it has been here just about with every other president that you've had, who've had no courage with which to take on white supremacy or dismantle the policies of race and racism, or even challenge this ideological perspective. And it's not only just an ideological perspective that's dangerous on the right, but a lot of white folks who consider themselves in the middle are filled with just as much racism and bias and prejudice as possible, misconceptions about Black folks and people of color. And one of the things that I always point out is that if you're Black or you're Latino, you generally have to go into a white community to work, to survive. So you have to learn how to speak their language a little bit. You have to learn the sensibilities of their culture a little bit. You have to work in close proximity to them. It doesn't happen the other way around. White folks very seldom come into Black or Latino communities and have to walk around them and learn to speak the language and learn about the cultural sensitivity. And so what happens is that all around us, there is a continual diet of white supremacist ideology. Just turn on your TV any particular night. Look at any TV show. The stereotypes are there. The stereotypes are there, and the good cop is there. The stereotypes are there, and the anti-terrorism is there. So in a sense, we've gotten very militarized in our own thinking, cultural, enculturated with what is presented to us through mass media. And we're never very critical about it. We don't think about what we're actually being fed a diet.
Yeah. Let's say a word. You mentioned we're going to come back to talking about the issues of racial justice. In fact, maybe they're interrelated here. While we've been talking about, Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, we're still dealing with the COVID pandemic, with more than 107,000 dead in our country, which the president now is more than willing to ignore. You've been an advocate for racial justice, for workers' rights your entire life. One of the things that's offended me the most is the way those on the political and the religious right account that some lives are worth more than others so we can reopen the country. In other words, some lives are more expendable. And I guess I want to ask you, how has the pandemic, this is poor people's campaign language now, how has the pandemic exposed the fissures that were already present in American society, but actually exposed them as even greater than we once thought?
Well, I can talk from a very personal experience because I've had about 20 funerals since this pandemic started. It has been members who were exposed because they were in the kinds of jobs that they could not work remotely. Everybody wants to talk about underlying conditions, and yeah, that's somewhat true. But when you start talking about a lot of poor communities, immigrant communities, you find you got folks who are working in convalescent homes, nursing homes, and they are not able to do social distancing. Had one young man died. This young man, he was in his 50s, a immigrant from the Cameroon. And we've been fighting that he could be able to stay in the United States because they had issued his deportation orders more than once, only to die now because the job he had was a job that he was there in the midst without protection and nobody seemed to care. So I've had funeral after funeral of people who've been exposed and older folks who've been exposed and have died. One of the things is that in Washington, D.C., the city is broken down into wards. And one of the quote unquote affluent wards tends to be Ward 4, or at least everybody thinks so. Ward 4 is also a very heavily Black ward, and it's also a very heavily elderly ward. And what they found out in this pandemic, that in the so-called affluent ward, it has led the city in contagion and comes only second to the poorest ward in the city. So it just continues to demonstrate to you that you talk about racial disparity, and you talk about racial disparity in terms of who has contracted the virus and who has died from the virus, and it's just very clear to me that this is not a hypothetical thing, and it's not something that I need to sort of create theories and hypotheses around, because I've been too busy burying folks.
Tell us a little bit more about your ministry, especially in this with the funerals and the ministry to the families in this time of pandemic.
Well, it's rough, particularly at the beginning, because families were not able to be present with their loved ones as their loved ones made their transition. If the medical staff wasn't too busy, somebody may have taken the opportunity, and in a couple instances they did, to do a FaceTime with the family members as the person passed on. But by and large, most of those people who passed on alone, and family members had to have funerals for them, and some of them didn't have funerals for them. Some of them just cremated because there was no place to go. The funeral homes were backed up with bodies, and so that could not be scheduled at all. I've done a few funerals at the church where we live streamed it so that people could actually see the service and participate in it in that way. But it's very difficult because you got families who have a real loss and don't necessarily have a sense of closure.
Speaking about your ministry, Graylan, have you ever had to have the talk with any of your young members?
Yeah.
You want to say a word about that?
Well, I mean, and it's something that's actively being discussed and has been discussed. Particularly my young men sit down, because we'll always have a few of them who get in trouble. A lot of them, most of them got in trouble undeservedly, I might point out. Just picked up on the street corner, singled out for whatever reason by the police. And next thing they know, they got some type of charge against them, which always then triggers the discussion that you're going to have with a larger group to try to get folks to understand what just happened, how they can avoid it, how they can basically protect themselves in a very hostile world. I was just thinking, I remember a story. My parents, I was born and raised in Baltimore. My parents bought a store after the '68 riots. And it was the store that we had a credit in. They called it the book. You put it in the book until payday, then you come back and you pay off the bill. It was after the riots that people decided to leave the city in this mass exodus, and my parents bought that store on the corner. And it was a few years into that my father decided that he was going to go out and buy a Lincoln Continental. And you got to remember, up until that point, we had used Fords and used Plymouths and stuff that they got off some used car lot somewhere. So he went out and bought it. That was his first new car. So we all went out, obviously, to pick it up. So we drive it off the lot. I don't think we've gone 6 blocks. Police pulls us over and says, routine check. And that's what they used to do to Black folks in Baltimore, was that they see you in a car, it was routine check, because it was to harass you all along the way. And so, it's clear that we got to talk to our young folks, because that was just raw then, but now it takes place in terms of jump outs, what's called jump outs in DC. I don't know if you're familiar with that term.
I'm not. Please explain it to us.
You're on the street corner, maybe talking to your peers, and all of a sudden the unmarked car pulls up and cops jump out and pull guns on you and shake you down on the corner. And obviously if you got anything on you, then you're locked up, that type of stuff. They're called jump outs. Well, the police here claimed, we had a meeting with them a while back, claimed, well, we don't do jump outs and and they kept trying to explain that. And so finally we had to say to them, said, look, I don't care what you call it. You got cops in an unmarked car jumping out on kids and shaking them down instantly and locking them up. I said, you can call that Mickey Mouse, I don't care, but you need to stop it. And that has been a bone of contention because they deny that it's happening all the time. And of course, we see it all the time. Those are the types of things that folks deal with on a daily basis.
We're speaking today with Pastor Graylan Hagler, Washington, D.C. Activist and advocate for racial justice and Palestinian rights. I'd encourage those of you who are on the interview via Zoom, if you have questions for our guests, please submit them through the chat function at the bottom of the page. I'm monitoring that and be happy to pass them along to our guests. Graylan, let me ask you about a brother, UCC clergyman, Otis Moss III from Chicago, has come out recently with a couple of films, one of which he named after James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, a requiem for Ahmaud Arbery. And then his next one was a sermon where he talked about the hymn, the great charge in the African-American community, we shall overcome. In The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he referred to the COVID, not 19 virus, but the COVID-16-19 virus. And in the second sermon, when he was talking about we shall overcome someday, he asked the question, when will be the someday that we shall overcome? You have a response to either one of these from your brother UCC pastor Otis Moss III?
Well, I've heard about it. I have not seen them yet, those pieces. But one of the things I immediately respond this way, I do on part of the time I take off or try to take off from the church, I do what's called a walk. For me, I call it a walkabout. And a walkabout is I go to some place that pulls at my soul in a particular way. And this past year, my walkabout took me down to Point Comfort, Virginia. And Point Comfort is where that ship arrived in 1619. It later became a fort, Fort Monroe there. But that was one of the places where my spirit took me to just stand on that ground. And then I went over to Southampton County, Virginia. And y'all familiar with what happened in Southampton County, Virginia. That was the Nat Turner uprising. Nat Turner was a plantation preacher. And basically it was because of partly his vision, his revelation that led him to not only organize people into a rebellion, but to lead that rebellion that closed down the entire southern lands for a while because everybody was afraid that there was going to be more and more slave rebellions that were going to take place. So that's a part of my sort of my own personal experience of walking those sacred grounds. And also realizing this is that, and this is kind of a struggle, I think, for all of us, is we always want to talk about nonviolence. But how do you remain nonviolent in a violent context? How do you remain nonviolent when no one seems to care? How do you remain nonviolent in that kind of setting? Because it requires a kind of revolutionary spirit at times. You know, so everybody was calling me up when young folks were out there looting stuff and wanting me to come out and condemn it. And I said, I will not. I will not condemn it. And the reason I won't condemn it is simply because when people are angry and people are outraged and nobody seems to have been listening, and we've been marching for decades for hundreds of years in one form or fashion, struggling in one way or another, and still we're in the same place, and that's the frustration that young folks feel, and they are responding. When we're talking about two separate churches, one was in Nazi Germany. You had Hitler that purged the seminaries and purged the universities of people and voices that were not sympathetic to Nazism. That's why we ended up in that period with a whole lot of German theologians in American seminaries, because they were fleeing Germany and coming into places like Union and places like that. But there was the Confessing Church of Germany, the Confessing Church of Germany that decided that enough was enough, and they set a bomb under Hitler's conference table. Did not succeed, but it was that Confessing Church of Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer dies on the last days of the war. Or I can point out another preacher, John Brown, right, who leads the rebellion into Harper's Ferry, but also out in Lawrence, Kansas first, who had brought with him a lot of the seminary-trained Black folks out of Oberlin Seminary, Oberlin Theological School at that point, who went and walked with him and fought with him and died with him. But these were the kinds of struggles. So we got to raise the question sometimes, and maybe we're being too superficial in our approach to things. And I'm not advocating violence or bombing or shooting, but I'm pointing out issues in history that changed the course of history. Because the Civil War really started with John Brown. John Brown fired those first shots of that Civil War.
What kind of resistance do you promote among your people and in the marches and protests that you speak at? Talk to us a little bit about that kind of resistance movement of which you're a part.
Well, one is we got to get out of the mentality of reforming, and we got to look at thorough restructuring and demythologizing.
Yeah,
because we're all built on this mythology of America being benevolent and all of that other type of stuff, and then we so conveniently forget about the histories where people had to fight and die because their government attacked them. I think about the miners in Colorado organizing for fair wage, and Rockefeller has the governor call out the National Guard on them, and they are killed and burned alive in their barracks. All those other types of things, the attempts at, bridging free speech, which Wobblies had to challenge free speech all over the country. We've had these kinds of fascist things over and over again. So as a part of us, I think we need to remember history, because the solution for where we are comes out of our understanding of history, what was done before, what types of models and paradigms are put in place that we have to oppose and destruct and deconstruct, the things that we have to demythologize. I'll give you a prime example. We don't look at language enough and the use of language. I don't refer to myself as an African American, for example. My people didn't come through Ellis Island. My people came through Sullivan's Island in South Carolina on an auction block down there, where my folks on my mother's side was on the same plantation for about 200 years. So I'm not an African American. I might be an African in the diaspora, but I'm definitely a Black person, which is a political term and a political perspective. One that is not at ease in America, one that refuses to be at ease in America, and a person that refused to trust the systems of America, for the systems of America are contaminated and need to be dismantled.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Graylan. I mean, you're singing our song here. I referred to him earlier, but Brother Cornel West says that recently in an interview said that, quote, America is a failed social experiment because, quote, its capitalist economy could not generate and deliver in such a way people can live lives of decency. The nation state, its criminal justice system, its legal system could not generate protection of rights and liberties. Our culture is so market driven, everybody for sale, everything for sale, you can't deliver the kind of really real nourishment for soul, for meaning, for purpose. I'm guessing you agree with him.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I do.
America is a failed social experiment because of what you just laid out for us and what Brother West lays out for us.
Yeah, but I would say that America is not a failed social experiment. It has been very successful.
In
because
what it's tried to achieve.
Right, it was conceived in greed, and it was conceived in elite colonial settler privilege, where basically those feudal powers in Europe originally gave huge tracts of land to folks who were loyal to them. And they drove off and slaughtered and practiced genocide against native populations in order to clear that land. And then that land was so large that they could not work it except through folks stolen out of Africa and enslaved in this country to work it. That's what made America wealthy, not some Wall Street genius or some financier. It was free labor that came through that whole system of enslavement and robbery of lands. That's what took place. You know, it's interesting. We remember the mortgage crisis. You know, when they were doing paper and junk paper and people couldn't pay back loans. Well, one of the ways in which was happening, particularly at the Louisiana Purchase, when that took place and there was new territories and new native populations to push off the land, all of the financial community basically created a formula of how much cotton could a hand pick. And therefore they lent money to the person to buy slaves based on how much money, how much cotton a hand could pick. And so you got 100% finance for your land and for those enslaved people. And then when the bottom dropped out, people began to understand that they had bundled those loans and they had sold them to the world markets in Europe, in the UK, in Germany, and places like that. And the market went belly up just like it did during the mortgage crisis because they were doing the same thing with land and human lives. And that's where the Gone to Texas ordinances came about. You know about the Gone to Texas ordinance? Because the states trying to protect those rogue landowners and those rogue slaveholders invented pieces of legislature all through the South that basically was able to say to the banks, sorry, you can't collect your loan, we're gone to Texas. And so you could go to Texas while you were sitting in Louisiana, for example. And so that became a part of the deal that was set aside, again, built upon corruption, built upon greed, built upon thievery. Those are the models of America that exist. So America has been very successful in exploiting population after population after population. You know, every single immigrant group that arrives usually find out that they're kicked in the butt, kicked around, exploited. But the difference is when you come from Europe, because of your pigmentation, the next generation, you'll be white and you'll be kicking everybody else's butt. And that's but that cannot happen for folks of Black and brown descent. It does not happen for folks of Black and brown descent. We are not part of America. We are the conscience of America. That's the difference.
You know, I hear a lot of people or see a lot of people saying amen in the on the screen here, Graylan. When you talk about Black people being the conscience of America, and America not, as Brother West says, a failed social experiment, but successful in its exploitation of greed. This sounds, you and I were talking about this before we came on the interview, about the 1619 Project, which is something that my Tuesday morning class had been reading in. How the first Africans had been brought to this country in 1619 to Virginia, and how American economy, healthcare, education system, criminal justice system, and more had been built upon the backs of, mostly negatively, of the African, the Black presence in our country, even before its founding. And so you're singing Nicole Hannah-Jones, the New York Times reviews, 1619 Project, you're singing that song.
Well, just think about it. When you look at, I'll bring up almost contemporary, 6 years ago, as Ferguson, Missouri blew up. You had all white police force, all black community. It was discovered that basically the black community was subsidizing the budget of the police department because the police department was writing all kinds of tickets, all kinds of court appearances, all kinds of, basically extracting money from the black community to fund the police department to oppress them, right? So it's a kind of ridiculous formula, but it's real and it's been practiced throughout time and over again. That's what Gandhi was talking about when Gandhi was sitting there with his spinning wheel and wearing his homespun, because what was going on all over India, and this shows you how racism and white supremacy works. What was going on all over India is that Indians were being pushed to pick cotton. And then that cotton was shipped to textile mills in the UK. And then they were forced to buy back the cotton in India, though India had produced the cotton in the first place. So that's when, in Gandhi's revolutionary experience, that's why he was sitting there with the spinning wheel, because basically he was taking their own raw materials and producing them there. And that's when he was talking about self-sufficiency in India. And so again, it's sort of understanding models to begin to deconstruct those models and to demythologize those models and to create a new understanding of what we have to do and how we have to do
it. And now Ferguson, Missouri has elected its first woman mayor, its first African-American mayor, just in the last few days.
Black police chief.
And black police chief as well, that's correct. We've got a question from one of the folks in our viewing audience here. Have police tactics become harsher since 9/11?
Well, police tactics have become more technologically advanced since 9/11. When I was little, like I said, in Baltimore, one of the initiation of rookies would ride in the back of the lockup wagon whenever a black man got locked up. And what they would do, they would beat that person senseless in the back of the wagon, and they would get blood over them, and that was a rookie's initiation into the Baltimore Police Department. And I remember that there was a shootout on my neighborhood. I lived in a neighborhood where we had some characters that did stuff like clockwork, and so there was a shootout this particular July night between a husband and a wife. And just so that you don't think that just the husband was shooting, both of them were shooting. And they came and they locked him up. And they were good friends living two doors away. And my father said to the cop, "You better not hit him." No, seeing the rookie get in the back of the car. And they turned to my father and said, "You can get some of that too, if you want." But that was police. And so when we went to get him on the other side to bail him out, of course, his eyes had been beaten shut. His teeth were missing, had been knocked out of his head. He had been beaten. And so that was just the rich. So when Freddie Gray happened, I was not surprised, because they were still doing what they had been doing, except that it was nobody in the back of the lockup wagon, but they were doing hard turns and bumps, basically trying to shake the person up in the back and kill them. I mean, those are the types of things that were going on. So police tactics have been police tactics. They use the tools at their disposal, and the tools are always harsh. And I'm afraid, because we were all afraid, and I'm using quotation marks, all afraid of terrorists in 9/11, we allowed them to pass the Patriot Act, which created more surveillance, which created more technological oppression. And that's what happens every time that we are afraid of something, or they stir us up into that hysteria of fear, is we allow more and more of our rights to erode, and for people basically to get greater control over us.
Graylan, in addition to your work for racial justice in our country, you've also been an outspoken advocate in the Palestinian struggle for human rights and political rights. I want to be very sensitive here, because I don't want to step on, I don't want to, the issue of racial justice, the systemic racism and the maltreatment and murder of Black women and men and youth by the state to be overlooked or to be co-opted. Nevertheless, we can't talk about police departments, military use of force, and police training in our country without making the connection to Israel and Israel's treatment of Palestinians. One of the questions that's been asked is refers to the issue of Israeli police training U.S. police forces and the idea of applying pressure on the necks that's something taught by the Israeli military to police forces in the U.S. You're in a good position. You're in a good position to maybe talk about this with us, Graylan, since you straddle both issues and you've been involved with them for many, many decades. Say a word about how the parallels here.
Well, we know there's exchanges that take place in terms of Israelis, law enforcement and Israeli military, training U.S. military and U.S. law enforcement on tactics of control, on supposedly anti-terrorism. And the issue becomes, we don't know if this knee on the neck originated in Israel or originated in the US or originated wherever they're putting people down. But one thing we know is that this knee in the neck has become a universal tactic of suppression, of subduing somebody, of particularly those that you do not think as human, that you put your knee in your neck, you inflict the greatest kind of harm, the greatest kind of pain. And so that has been clearly what has been going on in the occupied territories of Palestine, carried out by the occupiers, Israelis. And that's what's going on in the United States. And so it's no small coincidence. People weren't trying to steal anything when Palestinians stood up in solidarity with what's going on in this country right now, because Palestinians understood at a very visceral level what it means, because they have been going through that same type of situation in the occupied territories in Palestine. And so there's a great kind of affinity and relationship. And again, I'm gonna get back to the right-wing church. That's what the right-wing church don't want people to identify with, is that there is this affinity that exists between people of color, Black folks, and struggle in Palestine, just like there was an affinity that existed between Black folks in the United States and in the world, and Black folks in South Africa, because it is the same kind of condition that replicates itself. I mean, I think that it's a number of years ago when we were there, I think it was 2016, with a group of Black preachers. We went to the refugee camp right outside of Bethlehem. Some of you probably were there at some time. And we went there, we were asked to come there because we were with preachers, and they wanted to dedicate a monument that Playgrounds for Palestine had helped to fund. And so we went there. It was a rainy day, it was a rainstorm, and we went out there to the playground. And the playground, the monument there was dedicated to a 12-year-old boy that was playing soccer and was shot by Israeli snipers, who were actually, obviously, because there was nothing going on, so they were just shooting for fun, probably seeing who could hit this young boy, and they killed him. And the other side of the monument was to Tamir Rice, who was the kid that in the playground that the police rolled up on in Cleveland, didn't say nothing, jumped out of the car and just shot.
I know that shrine. It's in the Dheisheh camp, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah, the Dheisheh refugee camp on the outskirts of Bethlehem.
Right.
There's a question about how to mobilize and improve the Palestinian church leaders within the African-American clergy. You just referred to the trip that you took in 2016 with African-American clergy, friends of yours from the DC area and others. But it is a concern, is it not? Maybe it's theological or maybe it's political, but say a word about how to mobilize even more strongly within African-American church, in particular among its clergy.
Well, I mean, one of the things is that, and you know this because seminary conditions folks. Seminary conditions folks not to think outside the box. They hear about the glories of Israel over and over and over again, Zion all over and over again. And they're never taught to be critical that was then and probably didn't exist then, but it was a concept in somebody's mind and not necessarily a real territory, a real land. You got to go back and look archaeologically to sort of come to those conclusions. But we get caught up in this type of thing as if somehow Israel and Zion is ordained by God. We buy into the language that this is the people of God, the chosen of God. And we just listen to the exclusive language that we use in all of this stuff. And what I'm raising is that, am I not chosen by God? Are you not chosen by God? Are we not chosen by God? That is a statement of inclusion rather than a statement of exclusion. And then we got to teach preachers that God is not in the real estate business, and God is not a homicidal maniac either. And so the issue becomes for me is, where do we recognize the clarion call of the prophets that continue to warn the people, take away from me the sound of your harps, right? What is required of us but to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God? Or Amos says, take away from me all of your rituals, all of your rites, all of your sacrifices, all of that stuff I will not look upon, but let justice roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Somehow we avoid the absolute meaning of those texts, and we go for this glib theology that tends to prop up the status quo, tend to we become proclaimers of the status quo, and we do not question what is going on and think that is all ordained by God because it says so in the Bible. We do uncritical reading of our scripture.
Our mutual buddy, Steve France from DC, wants to ask you about Clarence Thomas's type of Black nationalism. You want to say a word about that?
Clarence who?
Clarence Thomas, Justice Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, Clarence Thomas is an assimilist. He is a part of the system, and he's proud to be a part of the system. He will never side with Black folks. And in fact, his arguments he used are circular argument, and he knows that they're a circular argument. His stance against affirmative action, for example, was because the way white folks would look on him. My attitude was, I don't care whether I got there by affirmative action or whatever, I'm there now. You have to deal with me, right? And I'm gonna take and do the best with what I got. So who cares how somebody looks upon me? I know who I am, I know what I have, I know what God gave to me, and I'm strong enough to stand and deal with any situation. And that does not come out of my own arrogance, that comes out of trusting in God and being a child of God, knowing that God has had my back all along the way. Everything I've been in, God brought me out and God brought me through, and I'm just gonna give praise to God. And so Clarence Thomas, ought to be ashamed of himself. He's like the house person that walks up to the slave master and says, "Are we sick today, master?" He's got to wait until the master tells them that he's sick in order for him to be sick.
You were very gentle there. We appreciate that. I've got two more questions. Already, like I say, in the 80s, you were involved in workers' rights, the Poor People's Campaign. I guess I want us to talk about that because you're the Washington, D.C. co-chair. The Poor People's Campaign has really become a mass national movement coalescing under one umbrella, a real broad coalition of organizations working for justice. June 20, 2020, the Poor People's Campaign will be holding their virtual march on Washington, D.C. the original dates of the real march that has had to be made virtual because of the physical distancing of the pandemic. So I want you to talk a little bit about your involvement in the Poor People's Campaign and why on June the 20th, we should all be online participating in the virtual March on Washington of the Poor People's Campaign.
Well, you already expressed that originally. It was to bring people to Washington, D.C. on June 20th, 2020, to basically show up as a Poor People's Campaign, call for moral revival. They've been organizing all over the country and basically working and going into poor communities to lift up the voices of those poor and struggling folks in those communities, operating upon a premise that there's a whole host of issues that feed into a larger overall umbrella of issues. And that is when we look at economic justice, or we look at healthcare or the lack of it. We look at income disparity. We look at gender issues. We look at sexual preference issues. I mean, the fact is that all of these things that are going on and the oppression that people are receiving because of them stems from the same agents of greed, the same agents of oppression, folks who want to keep people down. And so it doesn't stop with hatred against LGBTQIA people. It also doesn't stop with hatred against Black people. It doesn't stop with hatred against immigrants or hatred against Latinx. It doesn't stop with hatred against women. It just continues and it continues and it continues because it all comes out of the same format and the same model. And so what 2020 was intended to do was to bring people together from all these different streams, from Native American folks to stand up and talk about the issues of water rights and talk about the issue of land rights, to people talking about income disparity, to people talking about the attacks upon the environment in general, and all the other issues, voting rights and militarism, and where our money goes. And so we're trying to make this the biggest virtual march that has ever happened on the 20th. If you have not gone, you can go to Poor People's Campaign and you can sign up there to make sure that you get all the ways and notifications in order to be a part of that. But it's going to be something, and hopefully it's something that, as we have been building it over time, will continue to go forth in time and maybe do something about this depressing place that we're in as a country.
I want to return quickly to the unrest that's happening in Washington, D.C. this last week and a half, Graylan. And I'm not quite sure how to put this because I'm not a D.C. resident, but it strikes me that there might be some friction between the D.C. police under the authority of Mayor Bowser and the federal militarized forces under the Attorney General that are kind of stepping on the toes and stepping into the jurisdiction of the DC police, and that those two entities might police the protesters differently. Am I wrong? Am I right? I mean, I don't understand, that kind of internal DC politics very well, but talk to us a little bit about that in regards to the protests.
For those who are not from the area, Washington, D.C. is a colony. We exist really at the permission of Congress. Basically, we don't have voting representation in Congress whatsoever. And so it's a federal district. Under our limited home rule, which was negotiated, we were able to basically set up a Metropolitan Police Force that was no longer a federal employed force, and as well as fire department that came to DC proper. So that set up a battle for the battle that we're having now, because you got limited home rule and you got local leaders that stand in the way of somebody trying to federalize local police, and that becomes a struggle in itself. That's why they wanted to call in National Guard and troops from other jurisdictions and other bases around the country because they could not get necessarily the cooperation from DC, the full cooperation that they wanted from DC, and they really couldn't get it from Virginia either, I need to point out. And so that was a whole nother struggle, a whole nother issue. But then again, in these types of crises, it really highlights these types of issues. And here in DC, the whole colonial status of DC is amplified up under this crisis again. Now, let me also point this out.
Sure.
Because this points to that whole struggle around military and police.
Yeah.
In DC, a number of years ago, they passed a regulation that basically said that if you wanted to get on the police department, you had to complete 2 years of college. Or the way to get around 2 years of college is to go away to the military and then come back and you can apply. And in fact, you get preferential treatment applying, coming back from the military. So that automatically begins to set up the militarization of your police department. And what makes DC so desirous is because if you come to DC, you get on the Metropolitan Police Department, then you got a shot of being local enough that you can become Secret Service maybe, you can become Capitol Police maybe, you can become FBI maybe. All these different police departments that exist in Washington, D.C. Supreme Court police. You know, Supreme Court got their own police. I found that out when I got locked up at the Supreme Court a couple of years ago, right? They got their own, the Supreme Court got their own police chief, I need to point out. And then the FBI got a FBI police on top of the FBI to protect the FBI stuff, right? So this is give you a crazy idea of just how crazy this town is in terms of all of the different law enforcement agencies that exist up under law enforcement agencies. Now, I lifted that story because what happens is that you get a police force that more and more does not look like the people they're patrolling. You got a police force that more and more knows nothing about the neighborhoods in which they're patrolling or the people that live in those neighborhoods.
Absolutely.
They did not come out of those neighborhoods. They don't even know the culture of those neighborhoods. So they come in as if with some militaristic mindset to come in and keep people, quote unquote, in their place. And that's been the sort of strained relationship over and over again that we have seen. Now, when I'm on picket line, I talk to officers all the time, introduce myself. Well, it's always been interesting that the Black officers and the Latino officers, they always say stuff like this to me. Rev, I'm trying to hang on to my 20 years come, because I'm out of here, I'm retired here, this is racist as can be. Now these are your cops complaining about the racism of the cops. And it never fails, I get into that conversation with cops all the time who just particularly can't wait to leave because it's changed, the culture has changed, because you could grow up in the past, you could grow up in, let's say, Berry Farm housing projects and graduate from high school and then apply to become a cop and get accepted, get your training, right? And make your way out of the housing projects and raise your family up to a middle-class status in your generation. I mean, that's what was cut off to all these neighborhood kids.
I can't let you go today without this last question, and then I'll give you a chance to close with us. But we're in an election year, and we know that the president and his supporters in the political and religious right have been a disaster for marginalized populations. But we also know that even though in comparison, the Democratic Party and Joe Biden is heavily supported among African Americans and other peoples of color, nevertheless, within the mainline wing of the party, for decades, there's much more to be expected than what's been delivered. And I'm trying to say that nicely. What's your advice to us activists regarding the election, but also after November, depending on which candidate wins?
Well, somebody sent me electronically a Biden poster. And I opened it up and I broke out laughing because it says, "You ain't gotta like the motherfucker." Okay, so and I smiled. I said, "They just told the truth, right?" Because the issue is, we somehow think that some politician is going to be our savior. We think it over and over again. If our guy can get there, if our woman can get there, we're going to be saved. That's crap. A politician is only going to protect the political behind. We got to be willing to push whoever is there. Even if we think we like them, we got to push them. Even if we think that they walk on water, we got to push them. We got to push them because the reality is that nobody's going to do anything for us without us pushing and making sure that they get there. And right now, you see, why it's got to change. And, you know, people can sort of say what they want to say about Biden. And, Biden may give me some heartburn, but I'm going to vote for him. Right? I might vote twice for him. Just joking, y'all. Don't report to anybody, right? But what I'm getting at is that who you have in office right now could care 2 cents about you pushing him, because he is not trying to be your president or the president of this country. He's the president of a minority of white people in this country, the evangelicals in this country. They basically ran the Southern strategy in terms of getting elected, which means the hell with the popular vote, we'll get the electoral vote and get into office. That's what he did. And so he doesn't care about us. So there's no way you can push this man. There's no way you can rationalize anything with this man. We got to get somebody in there that we can push, that we can shove, that we can demand. But the thing is, it's going to demand that we remain activated and active. I remember when Obama got elected, I heard Obama say something that just caused my stomach to turn over. He says, "We won, it's time for you to go back home because we need to govern now." Biggest mistake of all time. Biggest mistake of all time. You motivate your troops, you activate your troops, you keep your troops in the streets, you keep your troops moving. That's what this guy is doing with the right-wing groups that he's got who's storming Michigan State House with firearms and rifles and assault weapons and all this other stuff that's going on in the country. And keep your eyes open, because as we go to this election, it's going to be more and more like that. It's going to be more stuff that's going to spring upon us. And so we need to be aware and we need to be ready to fight back.
I'm gonna let Pastor Hagler have the last word, but before I do, the next in our ongoing series of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace interviews will be next week, next Thursday, June 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, with Pastor Carrie Ballinger, English language pastor at Lutheran Church of Our Redeemer in the Old City of Jerusalem. So please share that news with your friends, and I'll be sharing it in our email listserv of activists and on our Facebook page and in social media. Next Thursday, June 11th, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Pastor Carrie Ballinger, English language pastor at Lutheran Church of Our Redeemer, Old City of Jerusalem. This interview with Pastor Hagler will be on the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace YouTube channel, posted sometime later on this evening or tomorrow. And if you're on our activist listserv, I'll be sending out that YouTube link to you all tonight or tomorrow when we have it posted. Finally, I want to say again, thank you to Ben Clemmer from WBOI in Fort Wayne for recording this interview to make it available to a wider audience at a later date. Thank you, Ben. Pastor Hagler, Graylan, you're a good friend for many years. Thank you for coming today. Any parting words for us? Well, thank you, Michael. And I see so many friends on here. Some of them I haven't seen in a while, but it's just good to see some of those faces, and bless you all for just continuing to be engaged in the struggle, because it's not a short-term thing. We don't win this battle in a microwave minute. We have to be out there consistently over and over again. The people get sick and tired of seeing us, and we get sick and tired of being sick and tired. I had a thing on Martin Luther King Day. I was down speaking on a radio program at a place down in Southeast Washington, D.C. And I walked out and I saw the mayor sitting over in a booth with her staff around her. And so I walked over there just to greet her, to be cordial. And the first thing out of her mouth, she says, "What did I do wrong?" And I said, "I just came to say hello. You didn't do anything wrong today yet," right? But you want folks to look in your face and start wondering what they did wrong.
because they know that you are not going to shut up or sit down, that you're going to be on their case, that you're going to drive home the message, that you're going to make yourself understood, and that you're not the enemy of anybody. And I'm not the enemy of anybody. In fact, I can consider myself to be the friend of everybody. But I'm not going to give up ground when it comes to justice, and I'm not going to give up ground when it comes to truth. I'm not going to give up ground when it comes to human life and people around me suffering and dying. And I thank you because you're the same way. In so many faces I see here that I know that you have continued to keep on keeping on. Reverend Jerry Foltz there, keep on keeping on. Amen. And I saw Zainab Azam on a little bit earlier, wonderful poet. But we're going to do what we have to do and make sure that we turn out and vote in November. It's can't do anything less. Can't do anything. If you got to crawl there, crawl, but get there to vote. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Graylan. You really remain a bold and courageous witness and model for all of us. You have friends around the country, around the world, and I count you as friend, but really as mentor in the resistance. So, Graylan Hagler, thank you very much. And we'll see you all next Thursday, June 11th, 2 o'clock Eastern with Pastor Kerry Ballinger. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Graylan, stay on for a minute, please.
Okay.